Hey everyone, today I want to walk you through a story that's heating up across the ocean, a story where crude oil, the specter of war, and great power rivalries are clashing in a way that's hard to ignore. I'm talking about Venezuela. Just last week, the United States deployed 8 warships, 1,200 missiles, 2,000 Marines, and even a nuclear submarine near Venezuelan waters. The Pentagon claimed it was an anti-narcotics operation. But let's be honest, nobody's buying that. At the same time, Washington offered a $50 million bounty for President Nicolas Maduro's capture, alleging drug trafficking links. That's the same bounty placed on Osama bin Laden, and 5 times higher than that of Muammar Gaddafi. Caracas fired back immediately. The Venezuelan government called it the most severe crisis in South America in 100 years, and mobilized 340,000 troops for emergency defense. So what's really going on here? One word: oil. Venezuela holds over 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, more than any country on Earth, and controls about 40% of Latin America's total energy resources. But since 1999, the country has openly defied U.S. influence, first under President Hugo Chavez and now under President Maduro. They nationalized oil assets, expelled American companies, and effectively sabotaged the free trade area of the Americas, a century-old U.S. project. Enter China. To understand what happened next, you need to know this. Venezuela's oil is heavy and hard to refine. Production costs once ran as high as $45 per barrel, 3 to 10 times the cost of Saudi oil. Meanwhile, China, with its massive infrastructure needs, was facing a shortage of heavy crude, covering barely 30% of its domestic demand. It was a perfect match. China provided financing, Venezuela repaid in oil, a loans for oil model was born. At its peak, the volume of oil China received annually from Venezuela matched the output of China's largest oil field, Docking. In total, China committed $62 billion in investment to Venezuela, $37 billion disbursed, $19 billion in loans, all backed by oil repayments. Over 300,000 Chinese nationals now live and work in Venezuela, far surpassing the number who lived in Libya during its civil war. But China didn't stop at oil. It introduced proprietary technologies like advanced catalytic cracking to lower Venezuela's extraction costs to $28 per barrel. More importantly, it began pushing for oil transactions to be settled in renminbi instead of US dollars, challenging the very foundation of the global petrodollar system. Once funding was secured, Venezuela handed over much of its national infrastructure. Chinese firms now control 70% of the country's telecommunications network. Chinese capital built roads, railways, medical facilities, and more. Then came the domino effect. Peru built a strategic port connected directly to Chinese trade routes. Brazil and Argentina developed rail projects with Chinese backing, and over 25 Latin American nations joined the Belt and Road Initiative. The entire continent seemed to be inching away from U.S. dominance. Washington couldn't stand by. As early as 2002, the CIA had reportedly attempted to assassinate Chavez, unsuccessfully. In the years since, the U.S. has imposed sanctions, funded opposition groups, and even launched a failed amphibious raid on Venezuelan shores. Despite it all, the left-wing government in Caracas held firm. Recently, the U.S. raised the stakes, imposing a 25% tariff on any country that purchases Venezuelan oil or gas. The goal? Cut off revenue streams and isolate the regime. But in today's global market, oil is slippery. Traders simply ship Venezuelan crude to places like Malaysia or Singapore, change the ship's name, erase its origin, and resell it globally, much like how India processes Russian oil and exports it to Europe. Ironically, the more the U.S. squeezed, the more Venezuela rebounded. Last year, the country posted economic growth of over 9%. That figure sent chills through Washington, because if Venezuela, right in America's backyard, can survive sanctions with Chinese help, it sets a dangerous precedent for others. Maybe you can defy Washington. So what does the US actually want? In my view, President Trump probably isn't looking for full-scale war. This looks more like a military knock at the door, a calculated pressure move. By escalating tensions, he's betting that Venezuela, already economically battered and politically unstable, will cave and agree to negotiations. If successful, the U.S. could regain partial control over strategic oil assets, shore up the dollar, and reinvigorate its energy markets. It's a familiar playbook, just like when the U.S. recently tried to pressure Hong Kong tycoon Li Ka-shing into selling a Panama port to BlackRock. That effort failed too. So here's the real point. Venezuela's fate won't be decided on a battlefield. It'll be settled at the negotiating table, one where President Maduro sits across from the U.S., and where China, despite being an ocean away, has very real skin in the game. Will China's oil diplomacy prove strong enough to beat the U.S. at its own game, right in its own backyard? Or will Beijing be forced to fold its hand and retreat? What do you think? Can China hold its position at the table, or is Venezuela destined to become America's next proxy war?